Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us now. The two Port Authority officers stood on either side of her, their voices professionally neutral, their presence anything but. The jet bridge stretched behind them like a long gray throat humming faintly with recycled air, and the distant mechanical groan of a plane preparing to push back from the gate. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in that particular shade of cold white that makes every face look guilty, every situation feel more serious than it is. Though this one, as it happened, was exactly as serious as it looked. Dr. Amara Osei did not move immediately. She stood at the threshold of the cabin door with her leather carry-on hanging from one hand, and she took exactly 3 seconds to look back at the first-class cabin she had just been ordered to leave. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She had stopped expecting that approximately 40 minutes ago. She wasn't looking for an ally, though she had found 1 or 2 in the past hour who surprised her. She was looking the way a chess player looks at a board before walking away from a game that isn't over yet, cataloging every piece, every position, committing the whole picture to a memory that had never once failed her. The cabin was very quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a plane preparing for a long flight, passengers settling into their pods, the soft clink of champagne flutes, and the rustle of cashmere blankets. This was the breathless quiet of 40-something people watching something happen that they weren't sure how to process. A man in a window seat had his phone angled in that particular way people hold phones when they're recording something and hoping nobody notices. A woman in her 70s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, seated in 2A, had not looked away from Amara for the last 10 minutes, and she did not look away now. Near the front of the cabin, the lead flight attendant, Brenda, her name tag read her platinum blonde hair, swept back in a severe chignon. Her smile so practiced it had calcified into something that no longer resembled warmth, stood with her arms folded across her chest. Captain Hargrove stood just behind her, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, radiating the particular kind of certainty that comes from 27 years of being the most powerful person in any room he entered. Neither of them spoke. They had already said everything they intended to say. Amara turned back to face the jet bridge. She reached into the front pocket of her carry-on and took out a small, worn leather notebook, the kind you'd find at an independent bookstore, not a boardroom, and she wrote something in it with a short pencil. 3 lines, 4 words. Then she tucked it back in. Of course, she said to the officers, her voice so calm it unsettled both of them in ways they would think about later. After you. As she stepped off the plane, the cabin door swung shut behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. What none of the passengers knew, what Brenda didn't know, what Captain Hargrove didn't know, what the gate agent fumbling with his radio didn't know, was what those 4 words in the notebook said. Call Theodore. Do it now. And if any of them had known, they might have found a reason to keep her on that plane. 6 hours earlier, the 47th floor of the Nexus Capitol building on 6th Avenue had been so quiet you could hear the city breathing 47 stories below, that particular hum of 10 million people and their ambitions, the white noise of a city that never fully sleeps and never fully wakes, just cycles endlessly between its hungers. The conference room occupied the entire north face of the building, floor-to-ceiling glass, looking out over Midtown in the deep blue of a Tuesday evening, and around the long obsidian table sat 11 people who collectively managed more money than the GDP of several small nations. Not one of them was speaking. They were waiting. They had been waiting for 3 minutes, which in this room at this table in a meeting that had been scheduled for 5 p.m. sharp felt like a small eternity. Then the door opened and Dr. Amara Osei walked in with a cup of coffee she'd made herself in the kitchen down the hall and a yellow legal pad under her arm, and the room realigned itself around her the way a compass realigns around true north. She was 39 years old. She was wearing a charcoal gray tracksuit, custom-made Loro Piana wool so fine it whispered when it moved, and a pair of limited edition Nikes that had cost more than most people's first car. Her hair was natural, pulled back into a low puff, and she wore no jewelry except for a thin gold ring on her right hand that had belonged to her mother. She looked to someone who didn't know better, like she was on her way to a gym class. She looked to someone who did know better, like a woman who had decided a very long time ago that comfort was the ultimate expression of power, that the people who needed to perform their authority through pinstripes and cufflinks were the ones who weren't yet sure they had it. She sat down, opened her legal pad, took a sip of coffee, and said, "Where are we on the Olympian close?" And that was when the room came back to life. She had built Nexus Capital from an algorithm she wrote in a studio apartment in East Baltimore at 26 years old, 2 years after finishing her Ph.D. in applied mathematics at Caltech, a program she'd entered on a full scholarship from a household where her father, Joseph Osei, drove a taxi 60 hours a week, and her mother pressed flowers between the pages of library books she couldn't afford to buy. She had grown up watching her parents navigate a world that required them to be twice as good, twice as prepared, twice as careful as everyone else just to be granted the basic courtesies that others received as a matter of course. She had absorbed that lesson so completely, so deeply, that it had calcified into something structural inside her. Not a fear, not a chip on her shoulder, but a kind of architectural precision, a refusal to leave anything to chance, or to the goodwill of people who might not wish her well. By 29, she had turned that algorithm into a predictive analytics firm with 3 employees and 11 clients. By 33, those 11 clients had become 800, and the firm had been profiled in 3 major financial publications, all of which had found creative ways to express their surprise that the person responsible was a black woman from East Baltimore with no legacy connections and no Ivy League pedigree, as if the algorithm cared where she'd gone to school. By 39, Nexus Capital managed $22 billion in assets across private equity, venture capital, and quantitative trading strategies. And when Dr. Amara Osei walked into a room, people waited for her to speak before they decided what to think. Tonight's meeting concluded in 40 minutes, a record for a deal of this size. The final confirmation of the largest acquisition in the company's history. Nexus Capital was purchasing a controlling stake in the Olympian Airways Group, the parent company of, among other things, Australis Airlines' 4 regional carriers and a network of premium airport lounges in 12 cities. The deal had been in motion for 7 months. The paperwork was signed. The only thing remaining was the $4.8 billion wire transfer scheduled for 9 a.m. the following morning. As the room emptied, Amara stayed behind for a moment, standing at the window with her coffee looking out at the city. Theodore Park, her COO, steady, brilliant, the kind of man who could project manage a moon landing without breaking a sweat, paused at the door. "You're cutting it close," he said. "Flight's at 9. I know." She was still looking at the window, though her eyes had gone slightly distant in the way they did when she was thinking about something other than what she was looking at. Theodore. "The Olympian deal? Which airline is the flagship carrier, again?" "Australis," he said. "Why?" She turned back and picked up her legal pad, just making sure she said, and the faint curve at the corner of her mouth was the closest thing to a joke she allowed herself in a boardroom. "That's my flight tonight." Theodore looked at her for a moment. "You're flying Australis to L.A., first-class seat 1A. She picked up her carry-on. "I'll be unreachable for 5 hours." She was almost to the elevator before the irony fully landed for him. He shook his head slowly, something between admiration and unease settling in his chest, and he wasn't entirely sure which feeling was more appropriate. JFK Terminal 7 on a Tuesday evening has a particular quality to it, not the frantic chaos of Monday mornings or the exhausted resignation of late Friday nights, but something in between, a kind of determined busyness that suits the people who travel, not because they want to, but because they must. Because the world they've built requires their physical presence in multiple cities, and the price of that world is an endless procession of security lines and departure boards and meals eaten standing up at airport counters. Amara moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times, and had long since stripped away any sentiment about the process. She had no assistant with her. She had declined a car service and taken a black cab from the office. She was carrying one bag, the leather carry-on, soft and dark with age, a gift from her father, when she defended her dissertation, and a tote with her laptop and a book she probably wouldn't read. She had made a deliberate choice years ago to travel without an entourage, without the protective bubble of assistants and security details and first-class lounges booked under a corporate alias. Not because she couldn't afford the protection she could afford to buy the airport, but because she believed with the particular stubbornness of someone who had earned every room she'd ever walked into that she should be able to move through the world as herself, without armoring herself in layers of wealth and infrastructure just to be treated with basic dignity. It was a belief she had paid for before. She knew that. She paid for it again tonight at the Polaris check-in desk, where the agent, young, efficient, not unkind, took her passport and spent approximately 4 seconds longer than necessary comparing the photo to the woman standing in front of her, her eyes moving in that subtle inventory that Amara had learned to recognize before she'd learned to drive. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't. It never was, not at first. It was the particular friction of someone recalibrating their expectations against what they'd assumed, and in the recalibration there was always a pause. "Everything looks good, Dr. Osei," the agent said finally, and her voice was genuinely warm, as if the extra 4 seconds hadn't happened. "Thank you," Amara said, and meant it because the woman was doing her job, and the pause wasn't malice, just the accumulated weight of 1,000 small assumptions that none of them had asked to carry. In the Polaris lounge, she found a seat near the windows that looked out over the tarmac and opened her laptop to review the Olympian acquisition documents one final time, not because she needed to, but because the methodical review of established facts was something she had always found calming, a way of grounding herself in what was known and certain before stepping into the unknown. The lounge was half full. A man in a suit was on a loud phone call about a merger that sounded significantly less complex than the one she had just finalized. 2 women in their 30s were sharing a bottle of wine and laughing about something that had happened on a previous flight. An older couple sat with the comfortable silence of people who had been together long enough that they no longer needed to fill the space between them. She looked up at one point and saw Australis Flight 217, parked at Gate 14, visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass. A wide-body Airbus, its tail fin lit in the airline's navy and gold livery ground crew, moving around it with the purposeful choreography of departure preparation. She looked at it for a longer moment than she'd intended, thinking about what it meant that in approximately 16 hours after the wire cleared, she would be the person whose company owned that aircraft, owned the airline, owned the gate, owned in some abstract but entirely real sense the space she was sitting in right now. She didn't feel powerful when she thought about it. She felt tired and slightly amused and aware in the particular way that too much intelligence and too much experience produces that the universe had an ironic sense of timing. She boarded when Group 1 was called, carrying her bag and her book, and she was the 3rd person to step onto the plane. The first-class cabin of a wide-body Australis flight is a genuinely beautiful thing. Deep navy leather individual pods with full privacy dividers, lighting engineered to feel like late afternoon, regardless of the time. A quiet that is specifically constructed to communicate that you are for the next 5+ hours insulated from everything difficult. She had flown in cabins like this hundreds of times, and she appreciated the craftsmanship of the illusion even while knowing exactly what it cost and who it was designed for. She found seat 1. A stowed her bag, settled in, and reached for her phone to complete the call she'd started before boarding the final verbal confirmation of the wire transfer scheduled to go through at 9 the next morning. That was when she first saw Brenda. The lead flight attendant was at the front of the cabin arranging something near the galley, and as Amara settled into her seat, Brenda turned and their eyes met for a fraction of a second, long enough for Amara to register the look, the same inventory she'd seen at the check-in desk, except that where the check-in agent's expression had moved quickly from surprise to professionalism, Brenda's moved to something else, something harder and more settled, the expression of a person who has just formed a conclusion and does not intend to revise it. Then Brenda smiled, a practiced, brilliant, technically flawless smile, and turned to welcome the man who had just boarded behind Amara in seat 1C with an effusion of warmth that was so markedly different in temperature that it was nearly its own statement. Amara looked down at her phone and finished dialing. She noted the time, 8:47 p.m. She noted the name on the smile, the number on the seat, the gap between the temperature of the two welcomes. She noted everything. She always did. Brenda Calloway had been working the Polaris cabin on Australia's long-haul routes for 22 years, and in those 22 years she had developed what she privately thought of as a finely tuned professional instinct, a kind of accumulated expertise that no training manual could teach and no supervisor could quantify, but that she was absolutely certain was both real and valuable. She could read a cabin within minutes of boarding. She knew with the confident certainty of long experience which passengers would be demanding and which would be gracious, which ones understood how things worked in a space like this, and which ones were here for the first time and didn't yet know the unwritten rules. She knew which passengers would require extra attention and which ones would be best served by being left to their own devices in the privacy of their pod. And she had always felt with the particular satisfaction of someone who has turned a skill into an identity that this ability to read people was what made her exceptional at her job. She would not have described it as prejudice. She would have been sincerely offended by the suggestion. She would have said and believed that it was experience, 22 years of experience of reading thousands of passengers, of learning that certain things correlated with certain behaviors, of developing the instincts that separated a merely competent flight attendant from someone who truly knew this world. She would not have noticed because she had never needed to notice that the correlations she was drawing were not between behaviors she had actually observed and the people she was observing them in, but between the people in front of her and the assumptions she had carried into the room before they arrived. The woman in 1A had come on board with a carry-on that was clearly expensive. Brenda knew leather could identify the softness and patina of something that had cost serious money, but she was wearing a tracksuit, athletic shoes, no jewelry beyond a single ring. No designer logos visible, though that was its own kind of sophistication that Brenda did not have the framework to recognize as such. She was young, younger than Brenda expected for this cabin, and she moved with a comfort and ease that Brenda would have found completely natural in a different body and a different face, would have read as the easy confidence of someone who traveled often and well, but which in this particular body and this particular face registered differently in Brenda's carefully calibrated internal system. Registered as out of place, as not quite right, as something that required watching. She greeted the man in 1C, Gerald Whitmore, a regular on this route, a pleasant enough hedge fund type who always ordered the same whiskey and asked after the same flight attendants with the genuine warmth of recognition, the warmth of knowing someone belongs in your world. And then she turned to 1A and offered the version of the smile that was technically correct in every measurable way and utterly different in the one way that mattered. She had no idea she was doing it. That was the thing that Amara, watching from 1A with the patient, well-practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to read rooms that weren't sure they wanted her in them, understood completely and immediately. Brenda was not performing a prejudice. She was expressing one that had become so deeply embedded in her sense of professional identity that she could no longer see the difference between her instincts and her assumptions. She was in the fullest and most damaging sense certain that she was right. She moved through the cabin taking pre-departure drink orders, champagne for the couple in 3A and 3B, a sparkling water for the man in 2C, a gin and tonic for the woman in 4. And the warmth she deployed with each passenger was genuine in its way. the warmth of a person who is good at her job and knows it and takes real pleasure in the performance of that competence. When she reached the row behind 1A, she leaned across to take the order of the man in 2B, Patrick Okafor, a tall, well-dressed man in his early 40s who would turn out to be a civil rights attorney, though Brenda did not know this yet, with a full recitation of the champagne options and a smile that reached her eyes. Then she looked up at 1A, almost as an afterthought, and delivered the glass of sparkling water without being asked. Not because she had observed Amara's preference, but because she had already decided in the efficiently running machinery of her assumptions that this was the appropriate level of service for this passenger. Amara accepted the water and said, "Thank you," with a courtesy that was genuine even in its completeness. She was not performing graciousness, she simply had it, and Brenda moved on satisfied, her internal system humming along its errors invisible to everyone in the cabin except the one person most directly affected by them, who was sitting in 1A with sparkling water she hadn't ordered, and a clear-eyed, detailed understanding of exactly what had just happened and why. In the row behind Eleanor Voss, 71 years old, retired federal magistrate judge, silver hair, swept back in an elegant bun, caught Amara's eye over the top of her reading glasses and gave her a very small, very knowing nod. Amara gave her the same nod back. Some recognitions don't require words. If you believe every passenger deserves dignity regardless of what they look like or what they're wearing, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel, because this story is just getting started. The final boarding announcement had played, and the cabin was settling into its pre-departure rhythm, that particular orchestrated quiet of a long-haul flight preparing itself, when Amara's phone buzzed with a message from Theodore Wire, confirmed for 0900, all parties aligned, see you on the other side. She was midway through responding 2 words, confirmed. Thanks, when Brenda appeared at her shoulder with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting for an opportunity. "I'm going to need you to wrap that up," Brenda said, her voice carrying the specific tonality of someone who is being pleasant as a technique rather than a feeling pleasant in the way that is also unmistakably an assertion of authority. "We're preparing for departure, and all devices need to be in airplane mode." Amara looked up, then looked across the aisle at Gerald Whitmore in 1C, who was dictating a text message to his phone with the full-throated confidence of a man who has never once been interrupted in the middle of something. Gerald's phone screen was blazing white in the dimmed cabin. No one had said a word to Gerald. Of course, Amara said, looking back at Brenda with a level steadiness that communicated she had noticed exactly what she had noticed. "I'm finishing a message. 30 seconds. I need it done now," Brenda said, and she said it with a smile which made it somehow worse. "Ma'am." Amara's voice was very quiet and very clear. "The gentleman across the aisle is currently dictating a text message. Are you asking all first-class passengers to put their devices away at this moment, or specifically me?" There was a pause. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. But it was the kind of pause that has weight, the kind that in the memory of everyone who witnessed it would expand to fill a much larger space. Brenda's smile remained precisely in place. Her eyes, however, did something more complicated. "I'm responsible for the safety of this cabin," she said. "I'm asking for your cooperation." Amara held her gaze for one more beat, then looked down at her phone, sent the 2-word message, and placed the phone face down on the armrest in airplane mode, all without another word. She looked back up at Brenda and waited. Brenda moved on. In 2A, Eleanor Voss lowered her copy of The New Yorker approximately 2 inches and observed the exchange with the quality of attention she had once used to evaluate witness testimony in federal court. In 2B, Patrick Okafor, who had boarded quietly and immediately opened a brief that he was reviewing with a highlighter, paused in his highlighting without looking up the way a person pauses when they've heard something significant and are deciding how to file it. Amara reached into her tote and took out her notebook, the small leather one, and wrote down the time, 9:04 p.m. Then she wrote a single sentence and underlined it. She had learned this habit from her father, who had kept a notebook in the glove compartment of his taxi for 30 years, not for fares or routes, but for incidents, for the things that happened to a black man in a particular kind of job, in a particular kind of city, that no one would believe if he didn't have it written down. Always document, he had told her, pressing a new notebook into her hands before she left for MIT at 17, because the ones who do these things are counting on the fact that you won't. She had never once gone anywhere without a notebook since. She closed it, put it in her pocket, and picked up the brief she'd been planning to review. The plane began its pushback from the gate, the engines cycling up to that first low, resonant hum that precedes movement. And for approximately 7 minutes, the cabin existed in a kind of fragile equilibrium. Gerald's hushed phone call, the couple in 3A and 3B, murmuring about their hotel, the soft sound of Patrick's highlighter, while Amara read her brief and noted without appearing to watch the pattern of Brenda's movement through the cabin. She noted that Brenda refilled Gerald's whiskey without being asked. She noted that Brenda paused at the couple in 3A and 3B to deliver a small, unnecessary speech about the dinner options with visible enthusiasm. She noted that when Brenda passed 1A on her way back to the galley, she glanced down at the notebook on Amara's tray table with an expression that was too brief and too practiced to be called anything but that Amara recognized, nonetheless, the expression of someone who is not used to being watched by the people they are watching. The equilibrium lasted exactly 7 minutes. Then the service card appeared, and it ended. The pre-departure service on a Polaris first-class cabin is one of those things that seems simple, but is in execution a precisely engineered performance, a sequence of small gestures designed to communicate from the very first minutes of a flight that the people in this cabin are valued and seen. Champagne is poured at eye level, not handed over and walked away from. Dietary preferences are confirmed by name, if possible, by seat number, if not. The whole thing is choreographed to feel effortless, which is what distinguishes the very best service from the merely adequate kind. Brenda was technically excellent at every part of this performance. She had the timing down with the precision of someone who had done it thousands of times, the warmth deployed with the consistency of a practiced professional, the attention to detail that comes from genuinely caring in some compartmentalized part of herself about the quality of her work. She was so excellent and so consistent that the way the performance broke apart at 1A was almost more visible for being surrounded by so much competence. She began at the back of the first-class section and moved forward, and at each row she asked warmly by name, where she knew them, whether passengers would like champagne or their choice from the evening's drinks menu, which she described with the particularity of someone who found the subject genuinely interesting. At 3A and 3B, she spent a full 2 minutes describing the differences between the two champagne options, her hands moving with the enthusiasm of a sommelier. At 2B, she leaned down to Patrick's level and presented the menu with a small, genuine smile, asking whether he had any dietary requirements for the evening meal, waiting for his full answer before moving on. She reached 1A and set a small bottle of still water on the tray table without a word, without eye contact, without asking whether still water was what this passenger wanted or whether this passenger wanted anything at all. It was done in the space of 3 seconds. It was so swift and so practiced that a person watching from a distance might not have noticed anything unusual, might have assumed that the passenger in 1A had simply already given her order that the still water was the result of a request. But Patrick in 2B had seen the whole sequence. Eleanor in 2A had seen it, and Amara in 1A had both seen it and felt it in the particular way you feel something you've felt before. Not shock, not even quite anger yet, but the familiar cold weight of being rendered invisible by someone who has decided, without evidence and without interest in evidence, that your preferences don't merit inquiry. She looked at the water for a moment. Then she looked up at Eleanor Voss, who had folded her hands on her magazine and was observing Brenda's retreating back with an expression of quiet, judicial assessment. Eleanor caught Amara's eye and made the smallest possible gesture with her chin, the kind of nod that says, "I saw it. You're not imagining it. Imagining." And in that moment, between two black women who had never met and who occupied entirely different generations of a very old struggle, there was a complete and wordless exchange of understanding. Amara took out her notebook and wrote down 9:09 p.m. Still water not offered. 2B champagne full description. 3A/B champagne 2-minute explanation. Then she put the notebook away and did something that would have surprised Brenda considerably had she been watching. She picked up the still water, took a sip, and returned to her brief. She was not going to make a scene. She was not going to escalate anything that didn't need to be escalated. She had been in enough rooms where the game was designed for her to lose, to know that the most powerful thing she could do right now was stay exactly where she was and document exactly what was happening, and wait for the moment, which she was already quite certain was coming, when the other side of the room decided to change the game. She didn't have long to wait. The plane was taxiing toward the runway, that slow, deliberate roll that creates a particular sense of finality of commitment, the sense that certain things are now in motion and cannot easily be undone when Brenda came back. She approached 1A from the direction of the galley with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is executing it with the confidence of professional authority. She stopped beside Amara's seat and clasped her hands together at waist height in that particular posture that says, "I am being patient with you." I want to make sure Brenda said, her voice pitched at a volume that was quite precisely loud enough for the nearest seats to hear, that your phone is fully powered down, not just in airplane mode fully off. It's a safety requirement. Amara looked up slowly from her brief. She looked at Brenda for a moment, then across at Gerald in 1C, whose phone was sitting right side up on his tray table screen, lit with a background image, very visibly not fully powered down, very visibly not attracting any attention from the lead flight attendant whatsoever. "Is it a requirement for this cabin?" "Generally?" Amara asked with a precision that was its own kind of statement, or specifically for me. Something moved behind Brenda's eyes. Not uncertainty, because she was not a person who easily entertained uncertainty about her own judgment, but something adjacent to it. A brief flicker of awareness that the question had been more specifically targeted than she'd anticipated. "I'm asking you," Brenda said, "because I've already addressed other passengers." "I didn't see you address the passenger in 1C, Amara said pleasantly. "I'm sorry?" The smile tightened. "Gerald," Amara said with the mild equanimity of someone citing a fact from a report. "He's in 1C. His phone has been on his tray table for the last few minutes. I wasn't sure whether you'd had a chance to speak with him yet." A pause. I wanted to make sure I understood whether this was a general policy or something specific to my situation. It was in its way a perfect maneuver, not aggressive, not accusatory, not the kind of statement that gives someone grounds for a counterclaim, but a clear and direct placement of the inconsistency on the table between them where everyone nearby could see it. Patrick had put his highlighter down. Eleanor had lowered her magazine to her lap. The couple in 3A and 3B had gone quiet. Brenda's smile did not waver. It had been in place for so long at this point that it seemed to have become load-bearing. "Maybe," she said, and the word came out with a particular quality, not quite sweet, not quite threatening, the tone of someone who believes they are being very patient with someone who is making their life unnecessarily difficult. "This type of flight isn't quite what you're used to." The cabin went very still. The engines continued their low, indifferent hum. The plane continued its slow roll toward the runway. These things did not pause for the weight of what had just been said, even though it deserved a pause. Amara held Brenda's gaze. There was no anger in her expression. Nothing that Brenda could have pointed to and said, "There, that's the belligerence I'm talking about." There was something quieter and considerably more unnerving, the expression of a person who has just had a hypothesis confirmed and is noting the confirmation with the dispassionate precision of a scientist recording data. "I appreciate your concern," Amara said. "My phone is in airplane mode. That is the FAA requirement for this phase of flight. I've complied with that requirement." A pause just long enough to be deliberate. "If there's a specific policy requiring full power down that applies to all passengers, I'm happy to comply. I'll also be interested to see the documentation for that policy." "Excuse me." Eleanor Voss spoke from 2A, her voice carrying the unhurried clarity of someone who had presided over courtrooms and was not accustomed to being ignored. She looked at Brenda with the expression she had once reserved for lawyers who were wasting her time. "I've been sitting here since boarding, and I can confirm that this passenger has complied with every request made of her." "I'm not sure what the concern is." Brenda looked at Eleanor. Something shifted in her posture, not backing down, not exactly, but recalculating. Then she straightened, pressed her lips together in a tight expression that bore the technical features of a smile, said, "Thank you to nobody in particular," and walked with purposeful steps toward the front of the cabin and into the cockpit. The cabin breathed again, carefully, the way a room breathes when something has happened that people aren't yet sure how to characterize. Patrick put his highlighter down entirely and turned his attention fully forward the way a person turns when they've realized that the document on the table in front of them is less interesting than what's unfolding in the room. He had tried 4 cases before the Ninth Circuit. He knew an escalation when he saw one, and what he saw was that Brenda was not coming back from that cockpit with an apology. He took out his phone, looked at it for a moment, and placed it on his tray table at a particular angle. He did not say anything to anyone about why. Captain Hargrove was 61 years old, had logged more than 30,000 flight hours across 27 years. With Australis, had received 3 safety commendations and 1 humanitarian award for his conduct during an emergency landing in 2009, and carried himself with the specific authority of a man who had been the most important person in every room he'd entered for so long that it had become his natural posture rather than a performance. He emerged from the cockpit door and crossed the first-class cabin with the measured pace of someone who has calculated that measured paces convey authority more effectively than either rushing or dawdling. He was silver-haired, broad-shouldered, and wore his uniform with the pride of someone who understood that the uniform was doing significant work. Brenda followed 2 steps behind him, and her posture had changed subtly. She was now in the mode of the senior employee who has escalated a situation to a superior and is waiting for the superior to resolve it in her favor, and the confidence in her bearing communicated her certainty about how this was going to go. He stopped beside 1A and looked at Brenda. Not at Amara. At Brenda. "Which passenger?" he said, as though Amara were not sitting 14 inches away. "Seat 1. Brenda said, as if Amara were a coordinate rather than a person. Hargrove turned then and looked at Amara with the expression of someone who has already reached a conclusion and is looking at the subject of that conclusion to confirm it. His eyes did the same inventory that Brenda's had done, and they arrived at a similar destination by a similar route: the tracksuit, the sneakers, the natural hair, the face that did not match the space in the way his instincts told him. A face in 1A should match it. And whatever doubt might have complicated that inventory was resolved quickly in the direction of Brenda's account. "I understand there's been a disruption," he said. "I haven't disrupted anything," Amara said clearly. "I'd appreciate the opportunity to describe what has actually occurred." Hargrove held up one hand, not aggressively, but with the finality of someone who has decided that this is not going to be a conversation between equals. "Brenda is my most senior purser. She has my full confidence. I'm not questioning her experience," Amara said. "I'm asking to describe what happened from my perspective, since her account may not be complete. She informed me that you've been uncooperative with her instructions and that you've been confrontational. The instruction she gave me was to fully power down my phone, which is not an FAA requirement, and which was not applied to any other passenger in this cabin. Amara's voice was still steady, still completely controlled, still the voice of someone who is accustomed to laying out an argument for people who have the power to dismiss it. I complied with the actual FAA requirement airplane mode, and I asked politely whether her instruction applied to all passengers or specifically to me. That's the full extent of my behavior. If that constitutes being uncooperative, I'd like to know where that policy is written down. Captain Hargrove looked at her for a moment. His jaw moved slightly, not speaking, just processing. Then he said the two words that landed in the cabin like something dropped from a height. "Calm down." Amara went completely still. Not the stillness of shock. She had heard these words before, had felt them before, had felt exactly this. The specific experience of being told to calm down by a person in authority when she had not, at any point, been uncalm. When calm was the precise and deliberate register she had been operating in from the moment she boarded, when the instruction to calm down was not a description of her emotional state, but a tactic, a way of reframing her measured clarity as hysteria, her reasonable request as aggression. She held his gaze. "Captain," she said, and her voice had dropped to something very quiet, very precise, the voice she used in boardrooms when she needed someone to understand that she was not going to be moved. "I am perfectly calm. I've been calm throughout this interaction. I've made a straightforward request to be treated consistently with the other passengers in this cabin. I've documented the incidents that occurred during this flight, including timestamps. I'm asking one more time whether there's a specific policy that was applied to me that does not apply to others, or whether we can acknowledge what's actually happening here." "What's actually happening," Hargrove said, and now his own voice had the stiffness of a man who has been challenged on his own aircraft and found it intolerable, "is that my crew has reported a disruptive passenger. I have the authority to remove that passenger. You can comply with my crew's instructions for the remainder of this flight, or you can deplane. That's your choice." "Captain." Patrick Okafor spoke from 2B calmly, his hands flat on his tray table. "I'm a civil rights attorney. I've been present for this entire interaction. I'd recommend reconsidering that. Sir, this is not your matter. I think it may become several people's matter." "Very soon," Patrick said. Still calm, still measured, still, very clearly, someone who was keeping track. Eleanor Voss had not spoken. She was simply looking at Hargrove with the expression she had worn when she sentenced people, the expression that said, "I am recording every word." It was the most unsettling expression in the cabin, and the captain had not looked at her directly, which suggested he could sense it. Hargrove turned back to Amara. "I need your decision." Amara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Brenda, who was standing slightly behind him with her arms crossed, and in Brenda's expression she saw the thing she had been watching for the satisfaction, brief but unmistakable, of someone who believes they have won. "I'll need you to put in writing." Amara said the specific grounds for this removal. "I'd like it documented before I leave this aircraft." Hargrove turned to the galley door and said, "Get the gate agent." The gate agent's name was Kevin, and he was 24 years old, and when he stepped through the cabin door into first class, he had the expression of someone who had been managing the departure of a wide-body transatlantic for the last hour, and was not emotionally prepared for whatever this was. He looked from Captain Hargrove to Brenda to Amara, and then at Patrick, and then at Eleanor, and then back to Hargrove, his lanyard swinging slightly as he absorbed the temperature of the room. "Kevin Hargrove said we have a passenger in 1A who needs to be escorted off the aircraft. Please call Port Authority and have them meet us at the door." Kevin's hand went to his radio with the automatic motion of someone following procedure, then hesitated just briefly, just long enough to glance at Amara again, taking in the first-class ticket visible on her tray table. The leather bag, the calm face that did not correspond to the word disruptive in any of the ways that word usually manifested itself. "Of course," he said, and his voice was only slightly unsteady. and he keyed his radio. When Amara stood up, the cabin reconfigured itself. She was taller than the setting had suggested. The pods had a way of compressing people into the general scale of seated comfort, and she rose with the unhurried completeness of someone who is moving at their own pace and not at anyone else's, and the effect of it was to subtly shift the geometry of the cabin, the balance of presence between the people who had ordered her off and the person being ordered. She reached into the overhead compartment and removed her carry-on, then settled it onto her shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who had done this gesture in hundreds of airports on dozens of continents. She looked at Hargrove. "I asked for written documentation of the grounds for removal. You'll receive the standard denial of transport notice at the gate," he said. "On what specific grounds failure to comply with crew instructions?" he said. And there was something in his tone now. Not guilt, nothing as complicated as guilt, but the particular tightness of a man who knows that the words coming out of his mouth are not the whole truth, and has decided to say them anyway because the alternative requires him to revise an opinion he has no intention of revising. "That is not accurate," Amara said. Her voice was the quietest it had been all evening, and the quietness of it was the most specific kind of attention-getter. It made everyone in earshot lean fractionally forward. I complied with every legitimate instruction. I questioned one instruction that was applied selectively and inconsistently. Those are not the same thing, and I want it noted for the record in front of these witnesses that I am disputing your characterization. "She's becoming aggressive," Brenda said from behind Hargrove in the tone of someone making a report. Amara had not raised her voice. She had not moved. She had not made any gesture that could be characterized by any neutral observer as aggressive, and every neutral observer in the cabin knew it. Patrick, who was now recording openly on his phone, the camera angled with the deliberate precision of a man who has decided that professional hesitation has its limits. Eleanor, who had risen slightly in her seat. The couple in 3A and 3B, who had gone very still. A young woman in 4A who had pulled one earbud out and was watching with the careful attention of someone deciding whether to say something. "I would like to speak to Port Authority myself," Amara said to Hargrove. "Not to resist, I'm not going to resist. But I want them to hear my account directly, not filtered through a third party." Hargrove said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Amara looked then at Eleanor Voss, who had risen fully in her seat and was watching the whole proceeding with judicial attention, and something passed between them, again that same wordless fluency of people who have spent their lives being precise in environments that prefer they weren't. Eleanor reached into the slim leather portfolio on her tray table and slid something free, a business card, cream-colored with clean sans serif type, and held it out across the narrow aisle. Amara took it without looking at it. She looked at Eleanor. Eleanor said very quietly, "You know what you're doing." Not a question, a statement, and a particular kind of one, the kind that means I see you and I believe in what I see. "I do," Amara said, and she meant it on more levels than Eleanor could have known. She walked the length of the first-class cabin toward the door, and the cabin watched her go, the way a room watches a person walk out of it when they believe collectively and half-consciously that the wrong person is leaving. She passed 3A and 3B, whose occupants were no longer pretending to look elsewhere. She passed 4A, where the young woman with the earbud met her gaze and gave a very small, very earnest nod that meant, "I see what happened here." She passed the galley where another flight attendant, younger, perhaps 30, with an expression that had been doing an uncomfortable amount of shifting over the past 15 minutes, stood with her hands clasped and her eyes averted, in the way people avert their eyes when they are aware of participating in something they aren't sure they can justify. At the door, the two Port Authority officers were waiting. They were professionally neutral, which was the most that could be asked of them in this moment, and which Amara appreciated in the way she had learned to appreciate the small dignities available within unjust circumstances. She looked at them and said, "Good evening," with a composure that made the taller of the two officers later telling the story to his partner. "Describe her as one of the most unsettling people I've ever escorted off a plane, and I don't mean that as a bad thing." She stepped off the aircraft. The cabin door closed behind her. The sound it made was solid and definitive, the sound of something ending, though what exactly was ending and for whom was not yet clear to most of the people who heard it. Amara walked the length of the jet bridge with the officers on either side of her and her carry-on on her shoulder and Eleanor Voss's card in her palm. And she looked at the card for the first time as she walked, and she read the name on it and the title beneath the name, and she thought, of course. The card read, "The Honorable Eleanor Voss, U.S. Federal Court, 9th Circuit, retired." She put the card in her pocket and took out her notebook. She wrote 3 words. "Call Theodore, now." Stories like this remind us that dignity isn't something you earn, it's something you're born with. If that resonates with you, please subscribe to our channel and share this story because more people need to hear it. The security office was located in a part of the terminal that the architects had clearly not designed for comfort or extended occupancy. A small, windowless room down a service corridor that smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, and the particular staleness of a space that circulates the same air indefinitely. The fluorescent lights above hummed at a frequency that sat just at the edge of consciousness, present enough to register without being distinct enough to identify. There were 4 plastic chairs arranged around a metal table, a small monitor showing a frozen split screen of security camera feeds, and a filing cabinet with a coffee maker on top of it that had clearly been making the same burnt coffee for longer than anyone in the building could remember. Officer Daniels and Officer Webb were both professional, both efficient, both visibly recalibrating the situation against whatever briefing they'd received from the gate, which had apparently prepared them for something considerably different from the calm, well-spoken, first-class ticket-holding woman who sat across from them and answered their questions with the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had given depositions before. They asked their questions. She answered them. They looked at her passport, Dr. Amara Osei, 39, United States, place of birth, Baltimore, Maryland. And they looked at her first-class ticket, and they did the small arithmetic of it that produced an expression of mild confusion on both their faces, the expression of people who have been handed a puzzle that doesn't quite fit the shape of the box they expected to put it in. Officer Daniels, older, heavier, with the demeanor of someone who has been doing this long enough to have developed a functional philosophy about it, set down her documents and leaned back in his chair. "Ma'am, I want to be straightforward with you. The captain has the final authority on his aircraft. Once he makes the call, it's our job to execute it, not to relitigate it. You can file a complaint with the airline's corporate office." "I'm aware," Amara said. She said it without sarcasm, without bitterness, with the steady neutrality of someone who has long since accepted that the process is what it is and that railing against the process is a less efficient use of energy than understanding it. "I don't hold you responsible for the situation." Officer Webb, younger, sitting slightly forward in his chair, said, "Can I ask, is there someone we should call? Is there someone expecting you in L? A?" It was, she realized, a genuinely considerate question, the kind of question a person asks when they're trying to make a bad situation fractionally less bad, and she received it in the spirit it was offered. "My team is already aware," she said. "I'm fine." She looked at the table for a moment and then said, "Am I being detained? Are there any charges pending against me?" Officer Daniels shook his head. "No, ma'am. This is an airline matter on their end. As far as we're concerned, you're free to go." "Thank you," she said, and she said it with a genuine courtesy that made both officers straighten slightly the way people straighten when they're thanked by someone who didn't have to thank them and chose to anyway. "I appreciate your professionalism." She gathered her documents, stood, and picked up her carry-on, and as she turned toward the door, Officer Daniels said, "You take care of yourself." Dr. Osei, and she heard something in his voice that she chose to receive as what she thought it was the small, inadequate, entirely human attempt of a person to acknowledge that something unjust had happened in his vicinity without having the power or perhaps the framework to do anything more about it than that. She said, "Thank you one more time," and she meant it both times, and she walked out. The terminal was loud after the silence of the security room, the universal airport noise of roller bags and departure announcements, and the low-grade exhaustion of several thousand people in various stages of journey, and she navigated it without hesitation, moving toward the windows at the far end of the terminal where she could see the tarmac. She found a seat in a dark gate area where an overnight flight had already departed, and she sat down and she looked out at Gate 14. Australis Flight 217 was still there. She could see the cabin lights through the oval windows, the shapes of flight attendants moving in the galley, the shadow of someone in a first-class pod, probably Gerald, she thought, probably on his third whiskey. The plane was fully boarded now, door closed, preparing to push back. She watched it for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and took out Eleanor Voss's card and looked at it again, the clean cream rectangle with its spare authoritative type, and something in the looking at it, the name, the title, Federal Court Ninth Circuit Retired, produced for the first time in this entire evening, a very small, very private smile, the kind of smile that doesn't advertise itself. She put the card back in her pocket. She took out her phone. She found Theodore's name in her contacts and pressed call. He answered on the second ring. "Tell me you're calling from the jet bridge," Theodore said, which was not a greeting so much as an anxiety. "I'm not," Amara said. "I'm in the terminal. I've been removed from Flight 217. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a person who has just processed something that their brain is briefly refusing to accept. It lasted 4 seconds, which is a very long time in a conversation between two people who communicate in precise language. "Removed," Theodore said. Not a question, a repetition the way a person repeats a word when they need to hear it again to confirm that the word is real. Removed. By port authority, at the captain's request, following an approximately 40-minute interaction with the lead flight attendant, Brenda Calloway, 22 years with Australis, who initiated the situation and escalated it each time I offered a reasonable resolution. She said it the way she said things in board meetings when the thing being said needed to be said clearly, and once with no decorative language to obscure the architecture of the facts. The captain backed her without investigation. I was accused of being belligerent. The formal grounds listed will be failure to comply with crew instructions, which is inaccurate. My God. Theodore's voice had the sound of someone who has just sat down and is not entirely sure their chair is going to hold. Amara. "I'm fine," she said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. "I need you to focus. I don't want a PR response. I don't want lawyers filing anything tonight. I don't want any of the standard mechanisms." She paused, watching through the terminal window as Flight 217's engines spooled up to their pre-departure whine. "I want to talk about the Olympian acquisition." Theodore was quiet for a moment. "I'm listening. Walk me through the current status." "Exactly." He walked her through it the way he walked through everything methodically and without unnecessary narration, which was one of the many reasons she had trusted him with the inner workings of her company for 12 years. The acquisition documents were fully executed. The representations and warranties had been verified. The board of Olympian Airways had voted to approve the sale 10 days ago. The only remaining step was the $4.8 billion wire transfer scheduled to execute from Nexus Capital's primary holding account at 9 a.m. Eastern Time the following morning. Once the wire cleared, Nexus would hold 62% of Olympian's outstanding shares, making them the controlling interest in the parent company of Australis Airlines and 4 subsidiary carriers. All that's needed is the wire Theodore confirmed. 9 a.m. tomorrow. Standard business hours. I want to move it up, Amara said. Theodore's pause was different from the first one. Not the pause of incomprehension, but the pause of a man rapidly running calculations. Amara. It's past 9 p.m. The federal wire system runs business hours only for transfers at this scale. You'd need bank authorization at the highest level. We're talking about calling people at home. Tonight. Yes. And even then, the counterparty has to be available to receive and confirm there are regulatory Theodore. Her voice was not loud. It had never needed to be loud to be the loudest thing in a room. You play golf with the chairman of our primary settlement bank. He owes you a favor that I have never asked you to call in because I've been waiting for a situation that warranted it. I'm telling you now that this is that situation. Another pause. Shorter this time. If we offer a premium offer, whatever is necessary. 1% of transfer value if that's what it takes. That's $48 million for a few hours of inconvenience. The number is irrelevant. She watched through the window as Flight 217 began its slow drift back from the gate, the tug guiding it with unhurried certainty toward the taxiway. I want controlling interest in Olympian Airways before that plane lands in Los Angeles. Theodore was silent for what felt like longer than it was. She could hear him breathing, and she knew what the breathing meant. She had heard this particular breathing pattern before when she had asked him to execute things that were on the very outer edge of possible, and each time the breathing had preceded the answer she needed. If we can get the bank chairman on the phone, he said slowly, and if he'll authorize emergency processing tonight, and if Olympian's CFO will confirm receipt outside of standard hours. He trailed off, running the if chain to its conclusion. It's not impossible. It's very expensive, and it's going to require some people to be significantly inconvenienced in the middle of the night. Yes, Amara said. Okay, Theodore said. Not enthusiastic, not reluctant. Simply Theodore doing what Theodore did, which was assess the available information and act on the clearest path forward. I'll call Hartwell. If I can get him, we move. There's one more thing, Amara said. Once we have control, once the wire clears and it's confirmed, I want you to arrange an emergency board meeting of the Olympian Airways board. Virtual, 6 a.m. Eastern. I want their CEO, his name is Philip Randall, to set it up. Tell him his new majority shareholder has an urgent directive and requires him present. 6 a.m., Theodore repeated. What's the agenda? She looked out the window. Flight 217 had reached the taxiway now, turning slowly, its lights blinking in the dark of the tarmac. It was out there moving through the ordinary machinery of an ordinary evening, its crew going about the ordinary business of a flight, and none of them knew what was rolling toward them at the pace of a wire transfer and 12 years of deferred leverage. The agenda, Amara said, and her voice had gone to that particular place it went, when she was absolutely certain the place below anger and above calculation, where a decision becomes something closer to architecture, is a staffing change. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Theodore said quietly, How many will discuss it at 6, she said. Just get me control of that company. She ended the call. She looked at her phone for a moment, at the time 9:31 p.m. At the missed notifications she hadn't yet looked at the small, dark rectangle of glass and memory that contained in some compression of reality the entire edifice of what she had spent 15 years building and what she was about to use it for. Then she put it in her pocket, picked up her carry-on, and went to book a suite at the TWA hotel, which was 3 minutes from where she was sitting and which she had stayed in twice before, and found both times that its strange retrofuturism, all curves and optimism, and the particular confidence of an era that believed the future was going to be magnificent, suited a certain kind of focused, purposeful insomnia. She had a long night ahead of her, and she intended to use every hour of it. The TWA Hotel is one of those places that seems, when you enter it for the first time, like you've walked into a memory of a future that never quite arrived. The soaring curves of the Eero-Saarinen terminal building, the sweeping staircases and pod chairs and red carpet, the whole aesthetic conviction of a 1962 that believed air travel was going to be glamorous forever and engineered its buildings accordingly. Amara had always found it oddly calming in the way that anachronisms can be calming things that exist outside of their correct time have a certain detachment from the present's urgencies, a quality that was useful when the present's urgencies were significant. She checked in at 10:15 p.m. and was in her suite by 10:25. She ordered black coffee from room service, set up her laptop on the desk by the window overlooking the tarmac, and sat down to wait. She was not, she realized, as calm as she had been performing calm for the past 2 hours. The performance was real. She had meant every word, executed every decision with the clarity she brought to any high-stakes situation. But underneath the clarity, there was something else moving. Something that had been moving since the moment Captain Hargrove had said calm down on his aircraft, and she had felt it the way you feel a particular word when it's been aimed at you specifically. And the aim is precise. Not anger exactly. Anger was too simple, too immediate, too likely to lose accuracy over distance. What she felt was older and more exact than anger, the feeling she had been learning to metabolize and redirect since she was 17 years old, and was told in her first week at MYT by a TA, who looked her up and down before she'd said a word, that she should check whether she was in the right lecture hall. She had been in the right lecture hall. She was always in the right place. She had spent her entire adult life making absolutely certain that there was no question about whether she was in the right place, building credentials and companies and wealth with the specific, relentless thoroughness of someone who understands that for certain people in certain rooms, the bar for belonging is set differently, and that the only answer to that is to clear it so spectacularly that the bar itself becomes embarrassed. She was in the right seat. She had the boarding pass. She had the ticket. She had built with her own mathematics and her own relentlessness, and 15 years of 18-hour days, the literal company that owned the plane she was sitting on. And she had still been escorted off it by a woman with a frozen smile and a captain who didn't want to hear her account because the account would require him to revise a conclusion he'd reached before he'd gathered any evidence. She thought about her father. She thought about him the way she always thought about him when she needed to hold something steady, not with grief exactly, though he had been gone for 4 years, but with the particular quality of presence that certain people maintain after they're gone, the way their most essential qualities continue to shape the rooms they no longer physically occupy. Joseph Osei had driven a cab in Baltimore for 30 years. He had been stopped by police 11 times in 30 years. None of which had produced a citation, and he had documented every single stop in a series of small blue notebooks that he kept in a shoebox under his bed. He was not a bitter man. He was the least bitter man she had ever known. But he was precise about what was happening to him, and he did not allow anyone, not the system, not the people in it, not even his own desire to think well of human beings, to tell him that what was happening to him was not happening. Always document, he had told her. And always remember the ones who do this to you are not your enemies. They are people who have not yet been required to see you clearly. Your job is not to destroy them. Your job is to be so undeniable that clarity becomes unavoidable. She had written that down too once in one of her own notebooks. She wasn't sure she was about to live up to it. At 2:14 a.m., her phone buzzed with a message from Theodore. 2 words Hartwell confirmed. She exhaled slowly, sat forward, typed back timeline. His response took 90 seconds. Wire initiating now. Regulatory confirmation est. 4:15 a.m. Olympian CFO standing by. Board meeting confirmed 6 a.m. Randall has been contacted. She put the phone down and sat with that for a moment, with the strangeness of it. The strangeness of sitting in a hotel room at 2:14 in the morning, in a city that was making its own noise outside her window while in the invisible infrastructure of banking and wire systems and regulatory architecture. $4.8 billion moved silently across the machinery of the financial world to arrive at a destination that would change before the sun came up who owned what and who had authority over what and what Brenda Calloway's career looked like going forward. She opened her laptop and looked for the first time with the permissions of a controlling shareholder. The access hadn't officially transferred yet, but Theodore had arranged a preview credentials set that Olympian's tech team had provisioned at midnight at the internal personnel files of Australis Airlines. She searched 2 names: Brenda Calloway, 22 years, no formal disciplinary record, 17 commendations. The file was impeccable in the way that files are impeccable when the behaviors that should produce documentation never get documented because the culture doesn't encourage documentation of those particular behaviors. Captain Arthur Hargrove, 27 years, 3 safety commendations, 1 humanitarian recognition, an equally pristine file. She looked at both files for a long time. Then she closed the laptop. She thought about what David, the younger board member during the 6 a.m. meeting that hadn't happened yet, would say. She thought about what her father would say. She thought carefully and deliberately about the difference between what she could do and what she should do, and whether those 2 things were currently aligned and what the cost would be if they were not. She did not arrive at a clean conclusion. She arrived at a decision which is a different thing. At 4:17 a.m., Theodore sent a single word. Done. She looked out the window at the tarmac. The sky over JFK was still dark, not yet the preliminary gray that precedes dawn, but the deep committed black of the hours when the night is most itself. Somewhere out there, Australis Flight 217 was crossing the American interior at 35,000 feet, carrying its passengers and its crew through the ordinary dark, all of them unaware that the world they were flying through had changed while they were in the air. She went to the bathroom and washed her face, changed into the black blazer she'd packed, not the tracksuit, not tonight, not for this. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, the way she sometimes looked at herself before a significant meeting, not for reassurance, but for the particular kind of honesty that mirrors provide when you're willing to receive it. She looked like someone who was about to do something that could not be undone. She was aware that this was accurate. She went back to the desk, opened her laptop to the board meeting link, and waited for 5:55 a.m. They appeared on the screen, one by one, like evidence being presented. The 9 members of the Olympian Airways Board of Directors materializing in the small squares of a video call at 6 in the morning, each one bearing the unmistakable expression of a person who has been awake longer than they wanted to be and does not yet understand why. Home offices and kitchen tables, and in one case what appeared to be a hotel room, all of them blinking in the particular disorientation of early morning light that carries the quality of emergency. Philip Randall was the last to join. He was 63 years old, gray-haired and heavy-set, with the perpetually worried expression of a man who had spent 15 years as the CEO of a company operating on thin margins in a difficult industry, and had allowed the vigilance that position required to permanently colonize his face. He appeared on screen and immediately located the square labeled Nexus Capital Drive, Osei, and when he found it, his expression did something complicated that compressed the entire range of his concerns into a single look. Amara let the silence run for exactly 5 seconds after the last attendee joined. Long enough to be deliberate, not so long as to be theatrical. Then she said, "Good morning," in the voice she reserved for meetings where she wanted people to understand from the first syllable what kind of meeting this was going to be. Dr. Osei Randall said, clearing his throat. "I, Robert from your team, indicated this was urgent. I've been told the wire transfer was the acquisition completed at 4:17 a.m. this morning," Amara said. "Nexus Capital now holds 62% of Olympian's outstanding shares. That makes me your majority shareholder, which means that as of this morning, the decisions I make in this meeting carry the weight of a controlling interest." She looked at the screen at the 9 faces, each doing their own rapid arithmetic. "I'll be brief, because the situation is straightforward." She told them what had happened. Not with emotion, she had made the decision sometime around 3 a.m. in the TWA hotel that she was going to describe the events of the previous evening without the emotional register they deserved, because the facts were sufficient, and the facts were what she needed these people to be sitting with when she told them what happened next. So she described it as she had described it to Theodore with precision and chronology, and the exact language of a person who had documented everything in real time, and she watched the faces on the screen move through their responses as she spoke. When she finished, the silence was total. Even the ambient sounds of 9 different home environments seemed to pause. No coffee machine, no traffic, no sound of a house beginning its morning, as if the world itself was waiting to see what happened next. Constance Webb, the board's senior legal counsel, spoke first, and she spoke with the careful control of someone managing her own alarm. Dr. Osei, on behalf of the board. "I want to say that what you've described is deeply concerning, and we take any complaint of this nature with the utmost seriousness. There are established processes for it becomes a board matter," Amara said, and her voice was very quiet and very clear when the passenger is me. The silence that followed that sentence was different from the previous one. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of arrival, the silence of a room that has just received the piece of information that makes all the other pieces cohere. Several of the squares on her screen went very still in the particular way of people who are rearranging everything they've understood about the last hour. Randall's mouth opened, closed. He pressed his hand briefly over his face. When he looked up, he had the expression of a man who can see with terrible clarity every step of the sequence of decisions that led him to this moment, and who understands with equal clarity that none of those steps are reversible. "I want to be direct," Amara said, "so that there's no ambiguity about what I'm communicating. What happened on that aircraft last night was not an isolated incident. It was the expression of a culture, of an attitude embedded so deeply in the normal operations of that cabin that the people enacting it are not even aware they're enacting it. It's the kind of thing that doesn't appear in complaint logs because the people it happens to have learned not to expect that complaints will produce outcomes. It's invisible to everyone except the people it's designed to be invisible to." She paused. "That invisibility ends today." She read the list. She read it without inflection, without haste, without the anger that would have been entirely legitimate, but that she had decided deliberately, and at some personal cost, not to perform, because she wanted these people to hear the list as she experienced it, as the cold, structural reality, that it was not as the outburst of a wronged individual who might be dismissed as operating from personal grievance. Brenda Calloway, terminated. Captain Hargrove, terminated. The first officer, the remainder of the flight crew, the gate agent, terminated. The gate's direct supervisor, terminated. The head of JFK Customer Relations, who would have received the captain's incident report and buried it under the usual language of crew authority and passenger non-compliance, terminated. There was a sound in the room, not quite a gasp, more like the sound several people make simultaneously when they understand the full scope of something. David Kinney, the youngest board member, spoke before anyone else could. He was 38. He'd been on the board for 2 years, and he had Amara noted the particular quality of someone who has not yet learned to be quiet when he believed he was witnessing something wrong. "Dr. Osei," he said, and his voice was steady and direct. "I hear what you're saying, and I don't doubt for a second that what happened to you was wrong. But what you're describing, removing an entire flight crew, a gate team, we're talking about people who have families and mortgages, and I know," Amara said. He stopped. The directness of it, not defensive, not dismissive, just, "I know," seemed to take some of the energy out of his argument. "Then I know," she said again, and this time there was something in the second saying of it that was different from the first, not softer but more complex. The voice of someone who is making a decision that costs them something and has decided to make it anyway. And I'm making this decision anyway because the alternative is to treat what happened last night as an anomaly when it isn't one. The people on that flight did not make exceptional choices last night. They made the same choices they've always made in a culture that has always rewarded those choices with silence. She looked at David directly. The culture changes because there are consequences. That is the only mechanism that has ever worked. Philip Randall, who had been silent through most of this with the quality of a man watching something happen that he is powerless to stop, said, "There will be union responses, FAA inquiries. The operational disruption alone is your problem to manage." "Philip," Amara said, not unkindly, "you are the CEO. Managing operational disruptions is what the role requires." She picked up the pen she'd had in her hand since the meeting started and set it down on the desk. "My problem was a pattern of conduct that caused harm to a passenger and that your airline's internal culture treated as unremarkable. I've corrected my problem. I expect written confirmation that my directive has been executed within the hour." She looked at each face on the screen, letting the moment land fully before she closed it. "Welcome to the new Olympian Airways group," she said. "I expect better from all of you. I expect you to expect better from yourselves." And then she moved her cursor to the red button at the bottom of the screen and clicked it, and the meeting was over. She sat alone in the hotel room in the early morning light in the silence that followed, and she looked at the window and she thought that was not the whole of what was right. And she knew it, and she had done it anyway, and what she would spend the next several months learning was whether those two things could be lived with. Marcus Webb got the email at 7:23 a.m. He was in the middle of his shift on the ground crew at JFK, guiding a regional jet into its stand on the south side of the terminal orange batons up the cold morning air, carrying the smell of jet fuel and the particular industrial clarity of a working airport in early morning. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he finished guiding the aircraft and gave the all-clear signal, and then stepped to the side of the stand and took his phone out. The subject line read, "Notice of Employment Separation Australis Airlines / Olympian Airways Group." He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he stood very still for a moment, looking at his phone while three of his colleagues moved around him with the ordinary busyness of people who don't yet know. He had been with Australis for 11 years. He had started as a baggage handler at 19, had worked his way to lead ground crew, had been cited twice in the airline's internal recognition program for efficiency and safety. He had never met Dr. Amara Osei. He had never been in the first-class cabin of a plane in his life, had never had any interaction whatsoever with any passenger, let alone the one whose situation had triggered in the invisible machinery of corporate decision-making the sequence that had just ended his employment. He had a daughter named Sadie, who was 8, and a son named Eli, who was 6, and a daughter named Priya, who was 4, all of whom were in the care of his mother this morning, as they were every morning, because their mother had left 3 years ago, and Marcus had been doing this alone. He paid $1,300 a month in rent. He had $740 in his checking account. He had been saving slowly and with significant discipline toward a security deposit on a larger apartment, because the three of them were currently sharing one bedroom, and he had been promising Sadie for 2 years that she would have her own room by the time she turned 9. He put his phone in his pocket, picked up his batons, and walked back out to the stand, because he didn't know what else to do with his body in the immediate aftermath of something that his mind hadn't yet caught up to. He worked for another 40 minutes because the work was concrete, and the concrete was what he could manage. And then he went to the break room and sat down and looked at the photograph he kept in his wallet. Sadie, Eli, and Priya on the steps of his mother's house, squinting against the sun. All three of them grinning in that specific way of children who have been told to smile and have overshot the instruction in the direction of joy. He had not done anything wrong. He had no framework for this. Across the country, the story was breaking in pieces. and the pieces were not arranging themselves in the order that the events had actually occurred. The first version to gain traction online, driven by videos that Patrick Okafor had posted at 11 p.m. the previous night from his seat in first class, clear and steady footage of Amara's calm, of Brenda's expression, of Captain Hargrove's certainty, of the two Port Authority officers flanking a woman in a tracksuit carrying a leather bag with the bearing of someone who had decided to leave a room rather than be seen struggling in it, was the version that was unambiguously right. The second version began to form by mid-morning when Philip Randall, panicking about his own position and trying to reframe the narrative in a way that cast the decisions that followed as external to himself, leaked the full scope of the terminations to a financial journalist who published within the hour. And the full scope was not just a flight attendant and a pilot. It was 24 people, a ground crew gate staff, a supervisor, the kind of cascade that looks from the outside less like accountability and more like a missile that has lost its targeting. Amara received the first indication of the shift at noon, watching a news segment from the penthouse suite of the Beverly Hills Hotel. She had flown to L.A. on a chartered jet at 7 a.m. because she had a board meeting at Nexus the following morning, and because she had spent the small remaining hours after the Olympian board meeting doing the operational tasks that her new ownership required. The segment was running a clip of a ground crew worker, not Marcus, a different one. A woman named Teresa, who had worked the 217 departure the previous evening, being interviewed in the airport parking lot with the particular emotional openness of someone who has been caught entirely off guard by her own situation. She was crying. She was describing her children. Amara turned up the volume. She watched for a while. Then she turned off the television and sat with the silence for a long time, and the silence had a different quality than the silence of the TWA hotel at 4 a.m. That silence had been the silence of decision. This was the silence of consequence, and they were not the same thing. Theodore called at 12:40 p.m. "The unions have filed," he said. FAA is initiating a review of operational stability given the crew transition. The stock has dropped 11% since markets opened. A pause. "And there's a video circulating. A ground worker. The story's starting to pivot, Amara." She was quiet for a moment. "How far has it pivoted?" "Enough," he said carefully. "Enough that the original story and the current story have different protagonists." She looked out the window at the smog-filtered afternoon light over Beverly Hills, at the particular quality of sunshine in L.A. that is generous and indifferent simultaneously. "Find me Marcus Webb's contact information," she said. "Who the ground crew worker who got the termination notice this morning? The one with 3 children." She had read his file at some point in the last 18 hours. She had read all of them. He was on the 217 ground roster. He didn't do anything wrong. A pause. None of the ground crew did anything wrong. "I need to think about that." Theodore was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll find him." She put the phone down and looked out the window for a long time and thought about precision and about what it costs when a precision instrument is aimed at a target that is wider than the thing it's trying to hit. By the following morning, the hashtag that had begun as something in Amara's favor had become its own argument. The original footage, Patrick's steady video, the clear evidence of Brenda's conduct and Hargrove's certainty, was still circulating, still functioning as the foundational document of what had actually happened on Flight 217. But alongside it now were the interviews, the numbers, the names, Teresa from the ground crew, Marcus with his photograph of his 3 children, a 26-year-old junior flight attendant named Danny, who had been on her 4th ever transatlantic and had received her termination notice before the plane had finished unloading in Los Angeles. The cultural conversation was splitting in the way it always splits when a story has a wronged party whose response is larger and messier than the clean narrative that audiences prefer. Part of it held firmly to the original shape to what Brenda had done, and what Hargrove had enabled, and what Amara had been subjected to, and the fundamental rightness of the demand that there be consequences. Another part had found a different story in the same material, the story of a billionaire deploying the catastrophic leverage of institutional wealth against individuals who had far less power than she did, some of whom had nothing whatsoever to do with what happened to her. The financial analysis was stark. Theodore walked her through it on a call that evening, sitting cross-legged on the hotel bed with her laptop open to the Nexus Capital trading dashboard and her notepad in her lap. His voice steady and unsentimental, the way it always was when he was delivering information she needed and didn't want. Nexus Capital had lost 14% of its market capitalization in 2 days. The Olympian acquisition, which she had leveraged significantly to complete, had become a $2 billion write-down as the airline's operational disruption mounted, and the FAA review introduced uncertainty into every investor's model. There were 17 separate class action filings in 4 states, primarily from passenger groups affected by the flight cancellations that had cascaded from the crew transitions. The board is concerned, Theodore said, and by the board he meant the people she had appointed and developed, and who had never in 15 years delivered a message she didn't want to hear in any other language. "They'd like to talk to you this week." "I know," she said. "Arthur has been calling." "I know that too." "Amara." His voice shifted fractionally, not softer. Theodore did not do soft, but more careful the way a person handles something they know is fragile. The Olympian piece is one thing. The market will reprice. But the narrative that's attached to you right now, the Osei overreach headline that's attaching to Nexus in ways that the business fundamentals can't insulate us from. She was quiet for a long time. On the television, muted, a news channel was running a graphic that showed a split screen on one side, the Patrick Okafor footage. On the other, a photograph of Marcus Webb and his 3 children that someone had found on social media. She watched the split screen without sound, which made it more honest in a way stripped of narration and argument. It was just 2 images of people in unjust situations, one of which she had not caused, and one of which she had, and the fact that one injustice didn't excuse the other was sitting on the edge of the bed next to her in the way that certain truths sit with you. Then the channel cut to Brenda Jenkins. She was sitting in an interview setting a neutral background hair. Perfect, wearing an Apex Air branded jacket. Apex being the carrier that had, with aggressive speed and aggressive PR, announced the hiring of the terminated Australis crew as a commitment to aviation excellence and second chances. Brenda was composed and warm and described the events of the previous night with the confidence of someone who genuinely believed her account, which was perhaps the thing about her that was most difficult to reckon with. She wasn't lying exactly. She was reporting what she had experienced from inside a framework of assumptions so complete that she couldn't see them as assumptions. "I'm just grateful," Brenda said on the muted television, "to be somewhere that values their people." Amara watched. She did not turn it off this time. She watched the whole thing through to the end, and when the interview concluded, she picked up her notepad and wrote 2 words at the top of a blank page. The first word was, "What?" The second word was, "Next." The knock on the door of her hotel suite came at 8:47 p.m., and she already knew who it was because Theodore had texted her 20 minutes earlier, "Arthur's here." L.A. "He asked me where you were staying." I told him. "I hope that's all right." It was Theodore's way of asking for retrospective permission, while also making clear that he had already decided this was one of those things that needed to happen whether she wanted it to or not. Arthur Mensah was 67 years old and had been her first serious investor, not the first person to believe in her, which was her father, but the first person in the financial world to stake real capital on the conviction that what she was building was real. He had given her $8 million at a time when $8 million was everything when she had been 28 and the only person in rooms like the one she'd been sitting in who looked like her, and he had given it without conditions and without the particular quality of charity that can make investment feel like condescension. He had given it because her mathematics was extraordinary, and her strategy was precise, and her execution was historically exceptional, and he had never in 15 years given her any reason to doubt that those were the only grounds on which he'd made the decision. He was one of the few people in her life who told her things she didn't want to hear and from whom she was willing to receive them. He stood at her door in a dark blue overcoat that was slightly damp. It had been raining in L.A. all day, the particular Los Angeles rain that the city has no infrastructure for and treats as a crisis, and his face had the lines in it that it always had, though they seemed tonight to be carrying more weight than usual, as though the gravity of the situation had added pressure to a structure that was already bearing a significant load. She stepped back and let him in. He declined the offer of water, declined to sit, stood instead by the window with his hands in his overcoat pockets and looked out at the city below, the particular blur of lights through rain-streaked glass that makes Los Angeles look at night like a reflection of itself. "They're not going to have the courage to say this to your face when there are 9 of them in a meeting," he said without any preamble. "So, I'm going to say it to your face now because after 15 years, I think you deserve someone to say it face to face." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. "The board is going to move to remove you, probably within the week." She sat down on the arm of the sofa. She looked at him. "Tell me something I haven't already calculated," she said. And it wasn't dismissal. It was acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a person who is already sitting with the truth and doesn't need it softened. "What did you want to happen, Amara?" he asked, and his voice had the quality of a genuine question, not rhetorical, not leading, but the actual inquiry of a person who wants to understand rather than judge. Not what did you want to achieve? What did you want to happen? She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the rain moved in patterns against the glass, the city existing in its usual indifference to any particular human situation. "I wanted them to feel it," she said finally. And the simplicity of the answer surprised her as she said it. She had been talking and thinking in the language of strategy and execution for 3 days. And underneath all of it was this very simple thing. I wanted it to actually matter. I wanted there to be a consequence that was proportionate to what happened, not a strongly worded email and a travel voucher. Arthur nodded slowly. "And was it?" She didn't answer. That was in its way the most complete answer. "You know what I've watched you do for 15 years, he said, coming to sit on the edge of the chair across from her. "I've watched you walk into rooms that weren't sure they wanted you and leave with the room changed. Not because you forced it, because you were so thoroughly, undeniably right about everything that the room didn't have a choice but to change. That's the most powerful thing I've ever seen anyone do in business." He paused. "This week, you walked into a room and changed it by burning it down. And there are people in the rubble who didn't have anything to do with the fire." The silence that followed had a weight that she had been carrying, she realized, since about noon the day before, since she had sat in the Beverly Hills Hotel and turned the TV up, and seen Teresa from the ground crew crying in the parking lot. She had been carrying it without naming it, and now that it had been named, she felt it more fully. "The board will vote," she said. It was not a question. "They will." And Theodore Arthur looked at her gently. "Theodore is going to vote to protect the company. You taught him that the company comes first." He listened. She stood up and walked to the window and stood where Arthur had been standing, looking at the rain and the lights. She thought about her father's notebooks in the shoebox under his bed, 30 years of stops and incidents documented in his careful hand, all the moments he had endured with precision and without bitterness. She thought about him sitting on the edge of her bed when she was 17, telling her your job is not to destroy them. Your job is to be undeniable. Your father would have been proud. Arthur said from behind her quietly of every room you walked into before last Tuesday. A pause. I don't know what he'd have said about this one. She didn't say anything. She continued looking at the rain. After a moment, she heard him stand, heard the soft sound of his coat, heard him walk to the door. "The people who wronged you were wrong, Amara," he said. "That is completely unambiguously true, and don't let anyone use what came after to obscure it." The door opened. "That's all. Good night." The door closed. She stood at the window for a long time after he left, and she let herself feel the full architecture of what she had done, not just the decision and its execution, which she had felt clearly and consistently since the moment she'd made it, but the shape of it in the world, the places where it had hit the things she'd intended, and the places where it had hit things she hadn't, and the gap between those two things, which was where most of the damage lived. She dressed the next morning as she had dressed for the 6 a.m. board meeting black blazer, the clean authority of something chosen deliberately, not because she expected the clothing to save her, but because she had always understood that how you carry yourself in the moments that are hardest is a choice that matters not for the people watching, but for the person making the choice. She had watched her father drive his cab with dignity through 30 years of moments that didn't deserve it, and she had understood since she was very young that dignity is not something the world gives you. It is something you maintain, and its maintenance is its own kind of resistance. The virtual meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. Eastern. She was in her hotel suite. She had not moved to an office or a conference room, had not assembled a team around her, because she had decided that if this was going to happen, she was going to be alone, when it did the way she had been alone at 4:17 a.m., when the wire cleared the two significant events of the week bookending each other in solitude. She opened her laptop. The call connected. The faces appeared. 9 of them arranged in the grid. She knew all of them, had known most of them for a decade or more, had hired several of them, had sat through hundreds of hours of meetings with all of them, knew their particular styles and fears and competencies and blind spots the way you know people who have shared consequential work with you for years. They were the board she had built, the brain trust she had assembled, and they were going to do what boards exist to do, which is to protect the institution, when the person at the top of it has introduced a risk that the institution cannot absorb. She knew this. She had designed the governance structure herself. None of them looked at their cameras directly when the call began. There was a round of deliberate paper shuffling, a coffee mug being moved from one side of a desk to the other, a window being looked at as though something interesting was happening outside it. The universal language of people who are about to do something uncomfortable to someone they respect and cannot quite make themselves meet her gaze in the moment before they do it. The board chair, Helena Ferris, who had been practicing corporate law for 30 years before Amara recruited her, and who was the least sentimental person in any room, which was why Amara had wanted her read the motion with the precise flatness of someone doing a difficult job correctly. The motion was for Dr. Amara Osei to take an indefinite leave of absence from her position as Chief Executive Officer of Nexus Capital with Theodore Park to serve as interim CEO with full executive authority, effective immediately upon the passing of the motion. "I want to say something before we vote," Amara said. Helena paused. The 9 faces looked at her, finally directly drawn out of their avoidance by the straightforwardness of the request. "I want you to know that I understand this decision," she said. "I'm not going to fight it. I designed these governance provisions myself, and I designed them precisely for situations where a person's judgment, including my own, needs to be checked by the institution's interests." She paused for a moment. "What happened on that flight was wrong. What I did in response to it was not entirely right, and I have been living with that distinction for the past 3 days. And I will continue to live with it for considerably longer." She looked around at the faces on her screen, the people she had made wealthy, had mentored, had trusted with the decisions that mattered, had built this with. "I'm proud of what we built together. Vote your conscience." The voting began. Helena, then Gerald Park, the other Gerald, her outside counsel, then the 3 independent directors, then the 2 investor representatives. Each square on the screen showed a face finding its resolution, making its peace with the motion, casting the vote that the situation required. No one was cruel about it. No one was performatively reluctant in the way that might have made it harder to bear. They were simply doing what they had been asked to do by the governance structure she had built, and there was a kind of terrible rightness in that, the rightness of a machine functioning exactly as its designer intended. Theodore Park's name was last on the list. He was the last square to move the last face to resolve into the expression of someone who had made a decision. He looked directly into his camera, and she knew because she had worked with him for 12 years, and she knew the geography of his face that he was looking for her eyes through the screen, that he was not avoiding her the way the others had, that he was choosing deliberately to look at her when he did this. He took a breath. "For the good of the company," he said, "and for the people who work here and depend on what we've built together," a pause just brief enough to carry the full weight of what it cost him, "I vote aye." She held his gaze. She gave him the smallest nod she was capable of giving. The nod that meant, "I know. I know why. You were right." And something in his face, some small release of a tension he'd been holding, told her he had received it. Helena read the count. The motion passed. The meeting adjourned. The screen went blank. For a moment, Amara sat in the silence that followed, and then she reached forward and tried to open the Nexus Capital internal drive reflex muscle memory, the action of 15 years of 10,000-hour days. A small box appeared. Access denied. Your credentials have been revoked. Please contact your system administrator. She looked at that message for a moment. Then she closed the laptop. She put on her shoes, picked up her keycard, and walked out of the hotel room and down the hall and into the elevator. And the elevator took her down to the lobby, and the lobby was full of the late morning light and the sound of the city starting its day. And she walked through it and out through the front doors and onto the street where the rain from last night had washed the sky clean, and she stood there for a moment in the particular stillness of someone who has just arrived at the other side of something significant. She had built everything she had from the algorithm she'd written at 26 in a studio apartment in East Baltimore. She had built it with mathematics and strategy, and a refusal to be invisible, and she had, in 3 days of righteous fury and imprecise execution, introduced into it a crack that was going to require a long time and a different kind of work to repair. She stood on the sidewalk in her black blazer in the clear Los Angeles morning, and she thought, now what? And then she started walking. 3 weeks later, in the apartment she had moved into temporarily while her Tribeca place was being sublet, a smaller place, a friend's guest room in Brooklyn, the kind of ordinary apartment that she had not lived in since her mid-20s. She sat at the kitchen table in the morning light with a coffee that she had made in a regular drip coffee maker, not a commercial machine or room service, and she opened a notebook, not the small leather documentation notebook she carried everywhere. A larger one, spiral-bound, the kind she had used in grad school, the kind with enough space to think in rather than just record. She opened it to the first blank page and sat with the blankness for a while, the way you sit with a room you're about to rearrange. Then she wrote down a name, Marcus Webb. Then 3 names beneath it, slightly smaller, Sadie Eli Priya. She wrote down Teresa's name, the junior flight attendant named Danny. 7 other ground crew members from the JFK roster whom she had identified and whose files she had read in the days since the meeting. She wrote all their names down slowly, one by one, and she sat with the list and she let it be what it was, a list of people whose lives she had disrupted in the course of a decision that was not wrong in its core, but had been too wide in its implementation, too indiscriminate in its execution. The kind of decision that happens when you are operating from pain and calling it strategy. She called Theodore. He answered on the second ring, which was its own kind of loyalty. He had been interim CEO for 3 weeks and was managing a company in a recovery from a crisis she had caused, and he still answered her calls on the second ring. "I need Marcus Webb's contact information," she said. A pause. The Australis ground crew worker. Yes. Another pause. Amara, I want to make sure, are you doing this as a legal strategy, or I'm doing it because I should, she said. That's all. He was quiet for a moment. Then I'll send it to you. She called Marcus that afternoon. He didn't pick up the first time, which she had expected. She left a message short, specific, not defensive, not apologetic in the preemptive way of someone trying to protect themselves from accountability, but direct in the way of someone who has thought about what they want to say and has chosen to say exactly that. This is Dr. Amara Osei. I think you know who I am and why I'm calling. I'm not calling to explain myself. I'd like to hear how you're doing. You can call me back or not. I'll understand either way. He called back the next morning. They spoke for 40 minutes. She asked questions and she listened to the answers, and when he said things that were uncomfortable to hear, she did not deflect or manage them, just received them because receiving them was the only honest thing available. He was not cruel. He was not looking for an apology. Specifically, he seemed more than anything to be trying to understand the shape of what had happened to him, the way a person fingers the edges of a bruise, not out of masochism, but out of the need to understand where the edges are. He asked her why, and she told him the truth, because she had been wronged, and she had used a powerful tool to correct the wrong, and the tool had hit things she hadn't intended to hit. Did it fix it? He asked. Not bitter, genuinely curious. She thought about Brenda in the Apex Air jacket on the muted television. She thought about the board meeting at 6 a.m. and the silence after she'd finished reading the list. I don't know yet, she said. I know it changed things. I'm not sure yet whether it changed the right things. He was quiet for a moment. Then my daughter asked me what happened. Sadie. She's 8. She asked why I lost my job. Another pause. I didn't know what to say to her. What did you tell her? I told her that sometimes big things happen far away from where you're standing and they knock you over anyway, and it's not always because of anything you did. And she asked if the person who made the big thing happen was bad. He was quiet again. I told her she was someone who was trying to do something right and did too much of it. Amara held the phone and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, that's more generosity than I deserve. Maybe he said. But that's what I told her. She asked if he would be willing to meet. Not for any particular agenda, not to negotiate, not to manage the situation, just to sit across a table from the person whose name was on the list in her notebook. He said he'd think about it. She said she'd wait. She put the phone down and looked out the kitchen window of her friend's apartment in Brooklyn at the particular ordinary view of a residential street in late November. Bare trees, parked cars. A woman walking a dog, a child on a scooter, being herded along by a parent moving at the slightly anxious pace of a person managing something faster than they are, and she felt, for the first time in weeks, like she was sitting in the actual world rather than a few inches above it, which was where she had been for so much of the preceding decade. She had built an empire on mathematics. She had spent 15 years being right about numbers and strategies and market positions and the precise replicable logic of capital allocation. She had been so comprehensively right for so long in all the places the metrics could measure that she had made the error of assuming the metrics were a complete account of what was real. They were not. There were things the numbers had never captured, the 40-minute taxi rides her father had taken people home from long after the shift was over because they'd told him something sad. The way her mother had learned the names of every librarian at every branch she'd borrowed from because names, she said, are the most important thing you can give someone. The specific quality of grace that Marcus Webb had offered her across a phone call in the middle of everything that had cost him something that he'd offered anyway. She picked up the spiral notebook. She looked at the list of names. Then she turned to a fresh page and started writing, not a strategy document, not a business plan, not a model or a framework or an acquisition thesis. Just things she was thinking. Questions she didn't have answers to yet. A note about what her father had told her that she had misapplied. A note about the difference between power and justice, which she was beginning to understand were not the same instrument even when aimed at the same target. She wrote for a long time. The coffee went cold. The street outside continued its ordinary life. She let it. The Senate Commerce Committee hearing on discrimination in commercial aviation was held on a Tuesday in January in one of the large wood-paneled hearing rooms of the Dirksen Senate office building, where the ceilings are high enough to make a person feel simultaneously significant and very small. The room was full, the public gallery, the press gallery, the rows of seats behind the witness table occupied by aviation industry representatives and consumer advocates and legal scholars who had all been invited to testify about a problem that the aviation industry had for many years preferred to discuss in the language of isolated incidents rather than as what it was. Amara was not the first witness scheduled, and she was not there as a CEO or a shareholder or a billionaire, none of which were titles she was currently using with any frequency. She was there as a passenger, specifically as a passenger who had been documented by multiple independent witnesses, and several hours of video footage experiencing a textbook example of the thing the committee was examining. The invitation had come from a senator she had never met on the recommendation of Eleanor Voss, who had submitted a written account of the events of October 14th that was precise and unsparing and had been entered into the congressional record approximately 6 weeks earlier. She was wearing an ivory silk blouse and dark trousers, and she had her notebook on the table in front of her. The small leather one, the same one she'd had on Flight 217, and a glass of water. And she looked out at the committee members with the direct, steady attention of someone who is not nervous but is aware of the gravity of the occasion. She testified for 40 minutes. She described Flight 217 in the language of chronology and specificity, that her documentation permitted the service snub the phone inquiry that applied to no other passenger, the escalation, the words "calm down," the captain's acceptance of Brenda's account without investigation, the walk down the jet bridge, the security room, the clarity with which she had understood at each step what was happening and why, and the equally clear understanding that her documentation of it was not going to change in that moment what was happening to her. She was direct about what came after. She did not characterize the board decisions she'd made as anything other than what they were, an overreach, a reaction that came from a legitimate source of pain and went too far, that hit people who had nothing to do with the thing she was responding to. She said this clearly and without the particular shame that can make a person over-explain because she had spent enough time with it now to be able to hold it plainly. Senator Raymond Cole, who had the reputation of asking the questions that other senators had decided not to, leaned forward when the formal questions had wound down and said, "Dr. Osei, let me ask you directly, do you regret what happened after the flight?" She looked down at her hands at the gold ring on her right hand, her mother's ring, and then looked up. "I regret the people who were hurt by decisions I made for reasons that had nothing to do with them," she said. "I have spoken personally with several of them. The conversations were among the more important conversations of my adult life." She paused. "I don't regret believing that what happened to me warranted a response proportionate to its source, which was not the behavior of one woman or one captain, but the indifference of a culture that made their behavior ordinary." Another pause, this one longer. "I made the mistake of thinking that power and justice were the same instrument. They're not. I learned that in the hardest way a person learns anything. I'm still learning it." The hearing room was very quiet. In the front row of the press gallery, a journalist was writing something rapidly in her notebook. "What would you want the outcome of this hearing to be?" Senator Cole asked. She thought about that for a moment. "I would want the people who do the work of maintaining fair treatment in these spaces to be supported structurally, not just by individual passengers who have the resources to respond when something goes wrong," she said. "Most people on that plane didn't have what I had. Most people who experience what I experienced don't have a Theodore Park, don't have a shareholder stake in the airline. They just get off the plane with a story that nobody documents, that nobody investigates, that accumulates in the same invisible ledger that has been accumulating for a long time. She looked at the senator directly. The cost of leaving that ledger invisible doesn't disappear. It just gets transferred to the people who can afford it least. The hearing continued for another 2 hours after her testimony. She stayed for all of it. 6 months after the hearing, Amara was in East Baltimore. Specifically, she was in a rented storefront on a commercial block she had played on as a child. She could see from the window the corner where her father had once double-parked his cab to buy her an ice cream from a truck. A moment she could reproduce in perfect sensory detail when she wanted to, that had been converted over the preceding 3 months into a workspace with 12 desks, a large whiteboard, a projector screen, and walls that were currently covered in mathematical notation, and the particular cheerful chaos of children who are learning something they find genuinely interesting. The program was called the Osei Foundation for Mathematics and Engineering, which was a name she had agreed to after initially refusing it on the grounds that naming things after yourself was the kind of thing people did when they wanted to perform generosity rather than practice it, and which she had eventually accepted after Theodore pointed out with characteristic directness that her name was the primary reason the foundation had attracted the caliber of partners and funding that made it viable. She had decided he was right and moved on. There were 12 students this session, 9 girls, 3 boys ranging from 11 to 15, all from East Baltimore, all from the same kinds of families that had produced her families where capability was abundant and resources were not. Where the gap between what a child could do and what the systems around them would allow them to do was a daily feature of life rather than an exception. She was teaching a Tuesday afternoon session on probability theory, which she had always loved for the particular beauty of its honesty. Probability didn't pretend to know the outcome. It quantified the uncertainty, and she had found over the course of the past year that the quantification of uncertainty was a much more useful thing than she'd previously been willing to admit. She was in the middle of walking through a problem on the whiteboard when a girl in the second row, Amara, had noticed her on the first day for the particular quality of her attention, the way she looked at problems with an assessing calm that reminded her of something raised her hand. "Yes, Kezia. Is it true that you used to be a billionaire?" There was a moment of barely suppressed laughter around the room, the particular laughter of children who are not sure whether their classmate has done something brave or inadvisable. Amara set down her marker. She looked at Kezia for a moment, this 12-year-old, who was looking back at her with the absolute directness of someone who has asked a genuine question and expects a genuine answer. "Used to be is a little complicated," she said. "The financial situation is currently in what I would describe as a period of reconfiguration." She picked her marker back up. "Which means it's a good time to make sure the things you build next are built on better foundations than the things you built first." She turned back to the whiteboard. "Which is also true of probability models. Let's talk about what you do when your initial conditions were wrong." After the session ended and the students had filtered out into the November afternoon, chattering and arguing about the problem set she'd assigned, she sat alone for a moment in the quiet of the room, in the smell of whiteboard markers and the particular quality of afternoon light through those windows, and she felt something she had not felt in a boardroom in a very long time, possibly ever. Not the satisfaction of a deal completed or a competitor outmaneuvered, or a number that had come in better than projected, but something older and less transactional, the simple weight of being in the right place, doing the right work. Her phone buzzed. Theodore Board called. "They want to discuss your return. No timeline pressure. When you're ready." She read the message. She put her phone face down on the desk. She looked at the whiteboard, at the equation still visible from the session at the margins, where Kezia had started writing her own notation in a hand that was still developing its confidence but was already unmistakably precise. She would call Theodore back. Later this week, maybe next. She was not in a hurry, which was itself a new thing, and she was learning to be in it without anxiety, which was an even newer thing. For now, she picked up an eraser and began cleaning the board for the next session. On a Wednesday morning in December, Dr. Amara Osei walked through the domestic terminal of Baltimore-Washington International Airport, wearing a charcoal gray tracksuit, clean Nikes, and her old leather carry-on over one shoulder on her way to a 9 a.m. flight to Boston, where she had a meeting with a foundation partner and afterward dinner with Eleanor Voss, who had become, in the months since October, one of the more unexpected and valuable friendships of her adult life. She reached the gate early. She was always early. That had not changed, and she was looking at the departure board and thinking about the probability problem she'd left half-finished on the whiteboard when the gate agent behind the counter looked up and said, "Excuse me, Dr. Osei?" She turned. The agent was young, mid-20s, dark-skinned, her natural hair pinned back beneath the airline cap, her uniform precisely correct in all its details, the uniform of someone who takes pride in the work. She was looking at Amara with the expression of someone who is about to say something they have been deciding whether to say. "I'm sorry to stop you," she said. I wanted to tell you something." A brief pause. The pause of someone gathering their nerve. "I told my daughter about you. Not about the airline thing or the stock thing or any of that. I told her about your testimony, about what you said about the ledger." She looked down briefly, then back up. "She's 9. She wants to study math now." She said a small, slightly surprised laugh. She said she wants to be someone who counts the things that other people don't count. Amara stood very still for a moment. The terminal moved around her in its ordinary way, the rolling bags, the departure calls, the particular ambient noise of a place where people are always arriving and leaving, and she was briefly completely still within it. She took her boarding pass from her pocket and handed it to the agent. She looked at her directly. "Tell her," she said, "that the counting is the work. The numbers always follow." The agent smiled, a real one, the kind that arrives without preparation, and scanned the pass. And Amara walked down the jet bridge into the morning. The plane lifted off over Baltimore in clear winter light, and through the oval window she watched the city she'd grown up in recede into its geography. The harbor, the neighborhoods, the grid of a place that had made her who she was in all the ways that mattered. She did not need to own anything at this altitude to know exactly where she belonged and exactly what she was going toward. She opened her notebook. She turned to a clean page. She started writing. Some people fight for justice with noise. Some fight with silence. Dr. Amara Osei fought with something rarer, the willingness to be wrong, learn from it, and build something better. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about courage, consequence, and the complicated, extraordinary work of becoming who you're meant to be.